Excuse me. Okay. Sorry we weren't able to connect on Monday about resume stuff. Let's chat real briefly after class and figure out a new time. All right, gang. Welcome back to another enchanting episode full of mystical applications of forest recreation history and elemental control and sick pop culture references. Yes, you've gone and done it again. We are back in Intro to Park and Wildland Management. And I've been here the whole time. No. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Let's kind of jump forward. If you recall, we've been talking about what was kind of the ancient world's sense of forest and outdoor recreation, and how did those cultures that have shaped a lot of Western cultures, so in particular Persian, Greek, and Roman cultures that have shaped what we call the United States, what we call the Western world today, the first world. Hopefully we have a better sense of a lot of the ideas that we have came from that time. And we'll start to see in a little bit more detail now, instead of in sort of lofty, big senses of how to order reality through all these different, Greek philosophical schools of thought. As we get a little bit closer in time, skipping forward from like the 400, 500, 600 BCE time frame up to about the 1000 AD or CE range, up to about 15 to 1700 or so across Europe. We'll see things in a little bit more detail because it's a lot closer to us, about 2,000 years closer in time versus those sort of big, grand, wide, zoomed way out schools of thought on how to understand the world. We'll also start to see a little bit more specificity in terms of people interacting with forests in a much more specific and structured way. So as we start to get more of a division of labor in more modern toward us Western European culture, we're going to see a lot more of the kind of the job titles and functional roles that some of you guys and gals are training up to be in as foresters really start to emerge and sort of solidify as a profession, not just like a collateral duty of like running the farm kind of a thing. All right, so with that, let's get into it. Before we get into nitty-gritty details of Western European history, does anybody have any announcements, any extra credit opportunities that involve forest and outdoor recreation in the next week or so that folks could take advantage of if they felt so inclined? Not so much. Conclave is this weekend. Kind of a big deal. All right. Everybody's going? No? No? You're going? Okay, good. I hope that most of you, if you're able to, can go. It's a lot of fun. You can learn a lot of things, meet a lot of people, and rub their face in it. No, up until about the year 2018 or so, SIU forestry dominated. We won like 24 of the last 25 up until that point, and then Wisconsin Stevens Point hired a professional timber sports person as a coach for their team and started winning about half the time. But yeah, we come from a proud history of just overlords in forestry conclave. So go, enjoy. It's a lot of fun. All right, so let's talk about Western Europe a little bit. So we have, again, a bit more of a division of labor. Now, we're still talking about kind of this hard stratification, this hard division between being a serf in ancient Greek or Roman culture. You might have called that an enslaved person or a slave. Excuse me. And here we have the same kind of thing. So serfs are land laborers, manual laborers tied to a farm, and they are tied to that specific farm. So upward mobility is not a thing, right? You inherit land and title and power and authority through a patrilineal system, right? So if your father is a lord, and you are the firstborn under the system called primogeniture, or firstborn primogeniture, then you're going to grow up and take over those lands and run that basically like a very, very small city-state. You're in charge of employing all of those serfs and running all of the unskilled and skilled labor that essentially turns that land base, those natural resources like we deal with in forestry, and converting those into material wealth in the form of board feet of timber or bushels of food produced or what have you, okay? And something like 98, 99% of the society was tied up in this serf class, right? Everything is manual labor. The horsepower here in farming is literal. And we have some advancements in agricultural technology to help us sort of produce more of that caloric surplus. So sooner or later, we're going to get the McCormick Reaper in the end of the 1700s, I believe. We're going to get the furrowing plow, so this blade that cuts through the earth and flips over the soil to prepare it for the next year's row crop agriculture and plow under weeds and stuff like that. So this is the time period in which a lot of that stuff is happening, where those tools are being invented and propagated across the earth. The philosopher Hobbes referred to life in this time, so this is the Middle Ages, this is the Dark Ages, this is pre-Renaissance. He called life, as they knew it back then, nasty, mean, brutish, and short. And so going back through archaeological remnants of, for example, the third class that is not listed on this dichotomy here, we have serfs, the landed class, and then we have the religion class, the monks, the nuns, the priests. Up until around the 1500s, right? There's the Catholic Church, and then we have the Roman Empire, in which the Catholic Church is starting around the year 0, if you believe that particular tradition. The Roman Empire splits into an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman Empire. So we have the Holy Roman Empire in the west and the Byzantine Empire in the east, and the church also splits kind of along those political lines. But for about 1,500 years, at least in Western Europe, the Catholic Church is going to be kind of a unifying factor or force, right? You're either a barbarian tribe, those godless heathens way up on the fringes of the North Sea or way out east in the steppes of Asia and stuff like that. So think like Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan much later, and so forth, right? Regardless of what language you speak, regardless of where you call home or where you're tied to as a serf, the Catholic Church is kind of the same across that whole space. And so a lot of the cultural decisions about what is good, what is okay, what is moral, those are all going to come from essentially Rome. And that's neither good nor bad, it's just a thing. That's how things operated for a really long time. And what that means for us in terms of forest recreation management is that it's the church that is determining what is the sense of what's the best and highest use of any kind of excess, surplus human capacity. Right? If we have any excess calories, if we have any excess time or physical health, right? People in this time, their bodies are infested with worms from head to toe from the day they are born to the day that they die. Up until the late 1700s, people are using wooden dentures, which have parasites in them, like in the matrix of the wood, feeding off of the food that we eat, right? We think of George Washington in the late 1700s and in the first couple of years of the 1800s, had vermin-infested wooden dentures. And things like medical care were basically anything goes, right? So, in this milieu of life being nasty, mean, brutish, and short, we have the church saying, okay, things like idleness. So some of us might call some forms of idleness leisure, right? We don't have to be out working in a field at all times. The Catholic Christian perspective in this 1500-year range is basically you're either working and devoting that work to the Lord and advancing that kingdom on earth, or you are sort of falling off of that narrow path and getting into drunken debauchery and stuff like that. And it's easy to sit in judgment on that kind of a diagnosis of what is okay and what is not okay these days. But back then, remember, until almost the year 1900, we're not going to have any safe water to drink. Anytime a well gets contaminated with something, like that whole village stands a reasonable chance of just dying out, right? Everybody pulling from the same well and drinking the same contaminated water where a raccoon or a possum fell in and just died or whatever. So there's cholera in the water, everybody just dies. And we don't know why. It could be an evil spirit. It could be a miasma or bad air. It could be an imbalance of the four humors of the body, right? The aqueous, the vitreous, the bilious, and the sanguineous humor. We thought that if you had too much blood and not enough bilious humor, like digestive fluid, then you get real sick and stuff like that, right? Nobody had any idea what was going on health-wise. And so we have a system of survival which has the royalty essentially running political control, the church essentially running sort of ideological control. A lot of the passages in the Old Testament, for example, that the church is enforcing are basic human survival and hygiene guidelines. Things like don't dig your latrines upstream from where you get your water, right? Don't eat certain kinds of meat after they've been out for X number of days, for example. If somebody has an open wound, separate that person from everybody else so that if they get sepsis or they get some kind of nasty infection or something like that, it doesn't easily spread to other people because we don't have any antibiotics. We don't even know what antibiotics would kill. We don't have an idea of the germ theory of illness yet, okay? So people are just trying to do their best through this time. And so that means something for forest and outdoor recreation. It's going to be much more close to home, just like in the olden days of the ancient world. It's going to be very family-based or local community-based because travel is slow, because 95% plus of everybody in this society is literally tied to the land that they were born on. Okay? So it's not at all unusual until about the year 1900. And we are well before that, centuries before that. It's not until about the year 1900 where it becomes more likely for somebody to be born in one place, grow up, move away for work, and die somewhere else. Think of this, like a huge, an overwhelming majority of people were born in a particular county or valley or village, grew up there. They maybe traveled once or twice to see distant cousins like 10 miles away. And they come back and they grow up and die. Okay? So a really, really different sense of life, a really, really different sense of the value and importance of travel, which is a big component of forest and outdoor recreation and has consequences for how many forest roads you and I got to manage when we're out there being foresters or park rangers. Back then, because the child mortality rate just to age 5 was up over 50%, and parent mortality was very high as well, right? We talked about how humans have, among all mammals currently present on Earth, the highest fatality rate from bringing a child or a fetus to term and then attempting to birth it. All right, that's inherently dangerous for mother and daughter and or son or whatever. because of this, we have a much more blended family structure than we generally tend to think about today. So in post-1950s United States America, we have the idea of the nuclear family. Mom and dad and kids as the sort of gender normative 1950s approach to things. But crucially, not grandparents, not grandchildren, and not cousins. That's the opposite of what things were like all across Europe and most of the rest of the world. Most other cultures adopted something similar, kind of out of necessity, as here. Here, your parents both might have died relatively young, like in their teens or 20s or 30s. And so maybe you're raised by an aunt or an uncle, or a great aunt or a great uncle, or you move in with some of your cousins who happen to be a little bit older than you. And the housing and family unit size is typically much larger than the 2 parents, 2.1 children, the family dog and picket fence that we have today as sort of a crude stereotype. All right? So things are really, really different. And as a result, the leisure and fun, the pastimes that we do see are very, very divorced from what we think of as forest and outdoor recreation today. Now, by the year, let's say 1500, let's remember that Europe has been colonized continuously for thousands of years at this point. Just like Southeastern Asia, right? China has 5,000 years of continuous civilization and history in its record. The Indian subcontinent has thousands of years of culture through the Dravidians and folks well before that, and so forth. So we don't have big, open, wild spaces across Europe. Not at this point. Not anymore. It's mostly all farm fields, and then the forests beyond, which are used as woodlots, or they're used as hunting reserves for royalty. So based on that, we have a real sharp stratification of, all right, it is safe and a known quantity to hang out with extended family, and a lot more people marrying first cousins in this time period as well, versus what we would be accustomed to or comfortable with these days. We also had a broad swath between or separating what was seen as acceptable with the gender dyad of male versus female across Europe at this time, right? So men were sort of forgiven for going out and being pretty rowdy and getting lit or turned up or faded, and so leisure for them looked like a lot of things like we would draw the analog of stuff like skee ball or bags or darts, stuff like that. That was totally okay for men, and various sort of low-tech forms of gambling. So at this time, dice games like craps or early equivalents of craps, it'd be carved out of bone typically. And bone is not a uniformly dense crafting material, and so you could get into some pretty exciting fights over dice that you thought might be loaded. Most of them were. And we also had the early version of cow tipping, which was, hey man, hold my mead, watch this, and jump over the split rail fence. And basically kind of a cross between cow tipping and the running of the bulls. Bull baiting was, you just try to run in there, see if you can piss off Angus the bull, and then get back out before Angus perforates your anus with a longhorn. And then this is sort of available to most everybody in the lower class, but subject to the social controls, again, of the church. And so the Catholic Church around this time starts to acquire, fair or unfair, merited or not, this sense of, go party hard, Monday through Saturday night, and then head into church on Sunday, say some Hail Marys, and get your slate wiped clean for the next week. Good to go. Partay. And various specific cultures at moments where there was a lull in warfare, or where they enjoyed some agricultural advancement, like a new cultivar strain of grains, or a new kind of grape for wines, for example. The French had several of these and developed a much more, at least for the upper class, a fairly elaborate and relatively rigid system of what was okay leisure for all the nobles. So let's talk a little bit more about that in a sec. But first, for those of us who didn't have the great good fortune of being born into a noble family, like the Targaryens or the Starks or the Lannisters or whatever, we had to work for a living. Which sounds pretty familiar to most of us here probably. So we have the apprentice, journeyman, master system. And leisure is built right into this professional system. So this is the precursor to what these Western civilizations will eventually codify into things like Oxford, which is a 1,000-plus-year-old college across the pond in the United Kingdom. But in order to power this system of each noble's lands, each noble's manor or deed or title, basically authority to run a big chunk of space, that requires a bunch of more specialized kinds of labor. It's not that each one of these manors is a village unto itself. It's about halfway there, though. It's more than just a big farm. So we need skilled people to do things like make barrels to store things. We call those people coopers. To turn some of our cattle hides and sheep hides into useful textiles, we're going to have tanners. We're going to have cobblers who make wooden-soled shoes, right? So non-timber forest product is going to be shoe soles, and then the tanners and the cobblers are going to get together and make leather boots, for example. And the way that we make this all work is by a fairly strict system of, at young age, we take a promising young boy from his family and apprentice him to typically a master or possibly a journeyman, skilled tradesman of whatever type, right? So ironsmith, carpenter, shipwright, right? All these different wheelwright to make wagon wheels and stuff like that. All these different skilled trades using early industrial machinery and mostly hand tools to fabricate everything the society needs to run. So at age 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, the apprentice is, for the smith, for example, waking up at 4 in the morning and shoveling coal or chopping up wood to, depending on the kind of smithing needed, feed the forge with either wood or coal to get it up to a certain temperature, and then operating the bellows all day long so that the master smith can churn out master works. This is the same system from which we get the terminology of the master's thesis these days. It's a masterwork. And then the journeyman is sort of that teenage to early 20s person in the middle of that training process. So they have more responsibility. They're allowed to actually produce things for sale, but they might not be sold for as much as the masterwork. But the journeyman is practicing his craft on things like nails and hinges, and eventually maybe working up to things like swords, if he gets the license to do that from the local polity. And so where you have a bunch of young men stuck together working really hard hours and so forth, to the extent that there's any seasonality with that work, right? So in the summertime, a lot of these folks are going to be more or less busy than in the wintertime, for example. These guys have some free time and certainly some spare energy, young and dumb and full of ale. And so we get terms like this. This was lifted out of a contract of a journeyman in one of these systems in Western Europe back in the day. So taverns and alehouses he shall not haunt. Dice, cards, or any other unlawful games he shall not use. Fornication, sex outside of marriage, with any women he shall not commit. Matrimony with any woman he shall not contract. Right? So this is a situation where it's hard enough to learn these trades that you can agree to your boss deciding who you get to marry. Kind of a different system. He shall not absent himself by day or by night without his master's leave, but be a true and faithful servant. All right? So, if you ever decide not to come to class, just roll over, send me a text message saying, "Hey Park, my car broke down." And be grateful that I am not your master teacher, right? I'm just here. You don't get habeas corpus, the right to determine where your body is at any given time. That's your master's job. And if you have a great master, awesome. You're gonna have a pretty good time. If you have an abusive or bad master, you're gonna have a bad time. Okay? Now, this system gets elaborated over time, excuse me, to the point of kind of this Jets versus Sharks intertrade brawls dynamic. So you can imagine at a local tavern where you have a bunch of blacksmith journeymen kind of shouting over the live band because they're all half deaf anyway from working hammer and anvil. And one of them says, "Hey Thomas, that Weaver journeyman over there says your mama's fat," or something like that. And the other smiths go, "Oh no, he didn't." And the guy's like, "Oh yes, they did." And then there's like a barroom brawl. This got to the point where these things had to be specifically regulated and outlawed. Like, it became so disruptive across Europe, just through these victories of very small differences. This would be like if you guys were at PKs or tracks or something, and you saw a bunch of geology majors looking, side eyes at you, and so you had to go beat them up just to establish dominance or something. Why? For no good reason at all, right? Nobody cares. It doesn't matter. But people apparently put a lot of stock and effort into perceived social comparative status. And so this got to be such a problem that we started seeing laws across Europe about these intertrade brawls and so forth, because it would escalate to the point of people getting maimed, so permanently injured, losing an eye, losing a hand, or even killed from festering wounds, for example, from these fights. And so these trade-based clubs or organizations or guilds, some of them went halfway underground, leading to the eventual establishment of things like secret festivals and rites. So if you're a Simpsons fan and you know what the Stonecutters are, that's exactly what this came from. Or the Masonic lodges, or the Elks lodges, or the Moose lodges. All of these have, or the IBEW Local 783, where you can go get a drink or a fish fry on Fridays or whatever. It kind of grew out of this from like 1,000 years ago. And it all kind of makes sense, right? So even in the 1700s, when this system is fully ensconced and well developed now, with the secret handshakes and all that stuff, we get quotes from prominent people like Ben Franklin, who described, "I drank every day a pint before breakfast, a pint at breakfast, with bread and cheese, a pint between breakfast and dinner, a pint at dinner." Dinner is a synonym for lunch at this time. Supper means dinner in our language these days. A pint at dinner, a pint in the afternoon about 6 o'clock, and another when he had done his day's work, right? Now, the beer that these guys are having is not like ice brewed, enhanced alcohol content stuff like Dragon's Milk we could get today or whatever, but it is absolutely alcohol to start the day and alcohol to finish it, right? So you can see how some of this stuff would happen. And under this milieu, if you've ever tried to hike while drunk, if you're not drunk while you're hiking, but you start drinking and you're hiking, you're gonna get drunk really fast. It'll hit you like a truck. You can see why folks aren't really out way off in the woods doing this stuff. They're so busy fighting each other and chasing women of the night and stuff like that, that there's not a lot of emphasis or record of anything that we would consider traditional forest and outdoor recreation today. Also, remember the Catholic Church is kind of running the show here. And so we have things like Saturnalia. So the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Roman Empire, which is, again, super influential across all of Europe at this time. They did sort of this embrace and extend strategy of where Christendom, any of these church-aligned countries like attacked and annexed, so took over a neighboring country. Those people would be introduced to Christianity or Catholicism, sometimes in a very friendly way, sometimes at the end of a sword. Remember, this is the era of the Crusades, for example. And sometimes the church adjusted its own religious practices and calendar to reflect local pagan traditions, right? So, for example, the idea of having Christmas on December 25th is based in Northern Germanic pagan tradition. The idea of decorating an evergreen tree, also based out of Northern Europe. The idea of Santa Claus, and so forth, on down the list. Easter in the spring, right? So Saturnalia was one of these. And Saturnalia was a kind of a pagan festival where you could go really hard, or at least it came to be understood as you could go really, really hard during Saturnalia and party so hard you and anybody else around you doesn't remember what we did, but man, I have all these bruises and I'm really sore and naked and I'm a county over. What happened? But it's a religious festival now, so it's okay. So interesting the ways that we take religion and move it around to incorporate things like pretty hardcore leisure. All right, so across this sort of emerging middle class, so around the 14, 15, 1600s, we start to get that apprentice, journeyman, master system that starts to lead to a merchant or skilled trades middle class, not just serfs tied to the land, which we would call working class today. Up at the top end of the scale, the top few percenters, those are going to be knights and legit royalty, and then scholars, which tend to be closely tied to the church at the upper level, and other landed elites, so people whose ancestors had titles and land and so forth, but maybe it's the wife of so-and-so or the dowager, so the person with the title has passed away and the title passes to the bride. But in a patrilineal system, women had sort of much less certain powers and rights in this time. The way that they experienced or expressed leisure is very different than everybody else. Okay, so we were talking about how across Europe we have a lot of settled areas, a lot of farm fields with relatively low efficiency farming. We need lots of space to do it versus the industrial intensive agriculture that we do today. And then we have any remaining forests, like the Black Forest of England, for example. Those are typically going to be hunting reserves. So if you think of the legend of Robin Hood, think back to the stories you read as a kid about Robin Hood, or maybe any of the movies you saw. Robin Hood is, in some distillations of the tale, he is a wounded warrior, a knight, fighting under King Richard in the Crusades. King Richard, historical figure, he's a crusader. And this guy, Robin of Locksley, gets wounded, so he takes the couple-month-long ship trip across the Mediterranean back to England. And he arrives back to his family estate, Locksley, to see that the king's younger brother, Prince John, who was not off in the Crusades, but back at home living it up while Big Brother goes and plays in the Crusades and murders a lot of brown people. And Prince John has taken over Locksley's land and the manors or estates of a whole bunch of other people as well. So, Robin of Locksley flees to where? Anybody remember? It's a forest.
Nottingham?
That's a good guess, right? So the sheriff of Nottingham, which is the local municipality, is aligned with Prince John and is kind of the local strong arm, another bad guy in the story. And right next to Nottingham, the town, is Sherwood Forest. And in Sherwood Forest, Robin of Locksley comes to see that there are a whole bunch of outlaws living there. And they're outlaws because they're trying to survive. That is, a bunch of people who have fallen on hard times, just the regular vagaries, their spouse and their kids die, their farm collapses, right? Their little village mostly died out from the plague, right? The plague is sweeping through Europe over the course of a couple of centuries here. And these people are in Sherwood Forest to hunt deer called hart, H-A-R-T, over in England at that time. And that is illegal because Sherwood Forest is the king's hunting reserve. So fox and hart hunting are elite activities. And if anybody else is doing that on the king's land, that is punishable. That poaching is punishable by death. Right? And that's purely a flex on everybody down lower in the hierarchy. So, Robin Hood steals from the rich and gives to the poor, operating out of Sherwood Forest as an outlaw. And he eventually takes on men and, depending on the story, a few women from kind of all walks of life who realize that the system is A, stacked against them, and B, thoroughly broken and corrupt. And so what is meant for forest and outdoor recreation for the elite few becomes democratized in a way for everybody else, where Robin Hood is hunting a bunch of these deer and then giving them on the down low to starving families in Nottingham and other places like Locksley. So that's a big deal. And the fact that this story sort of encoded that perspective of, man, these upper class folks are kind of parasitic on everybody else, that gives us a clue on how people thought about power structures and leisure in the form of fox and deer hunting at the time. Other elite activities that we would call like what would eventually become mostly like sports or competitions, so competitive shooting, biathlon, stuff like that. A lot of that has its roots in essentially training the elites, particularly the warrior elite, so the knight class, how to do war fighting, but sort of with blunted weapons and so forth, so they're not killing their training partners each time. So much was invested in having essentially the Western European version of the samurai class ready to take up arms and march off to war each spring, was that in some of these battles, when a knight was unhorsed or knocked off his horse by a lance or a crossbow bolt or something like that, the entire battle would stop, and everybody would pray for the downed knight on both sides, right? Because this is maybe the French fighting the English, and the Catholic Church is over both up until about the 1500s again. So just a weird and different sense of things versus today. We certainly don't stop war fighting to pray for our opponent if he's at the top of the military pecking order these days. Now we just bunker bomb them or something. We also, in the 1100s, under Eleanor of Aquitaine, get this idea of chivalry, which is from the French word for horsemanship, or chevalier. And in this time, with kind of simultaneously with the development of kind of this skilled middle class, or this merchant class coming up, we have some people able to move from these landed estates to villages and turn them into towns, turn the towns into cities, turn the cities into very small versions of what we would today call a city. So London at the time of the year like 1000 was barely larger than Carbondale, right? And that was a big city back then, but with no indoor plumbing, with no sanitary services, no nothing like that, right? A city of 20 or 30,000 is plenty big enough, like everything stinks, all right? So, very different sense of life at that time. And then we roll into about the year 1500, and a lot of stuff starts kind of speeding up both politically and technologically around this time. So we're not going to go through like the history of religion or anything, but just a couple of high notes here. In 1517, a Catholic monk, Martin Luther, wanted to reform some corrupt practices he saw from the inside of the Catholic Church. And so he got a bunch of paper, wrote down 95 specific problems that he saw, 95 theses about issues with the Catholic Church. For example, the selling of indulgences. If you had a particularly big sin, if you made a big donation to the Catholic Church, they would pray on your behalf for you and get that forgiven. And he thought that was a pretty good racket, but he disagreed with it. And 94 other similar things. And that sparked a major schism in Europe, at least the northern and westernmost sections of Europe, split off from the Catholic Church. And that was not Martin Luther's plan at the beginning, but that's kind of how it ended up. And then from there, the fracturing of this unifying force, the Catholic Church, all across Western Europe, down into the Mediterranean, it starts to fracture more and it starts to fracture faster. So we get hardline or fundamentalist groups like Puritans, who took some major exceptions to some of the fundamental underpinnings or basic tenets or ideas of Catholicism in terms of the church as an organization. Everybody along these lines still is, venerating Jesus as a savior and stuff like that. But in terms of the day-to-day mechanisms of how the church works, what the church should be doing, and how, by extension, individual humans should be living, major changes, right? So instead of things like Saturnalia, where it's like party super hard once a year and, maybe we'll meet some people and start some new families and stuff like that, the Puritans saw all of that as just profoundly, thoroughly corrupt or adulterated from the original sense of what was good or true or right. So they had this idea of, well, God gave us bodies and brains, let's put those to work as an act of worship and not party like it's 1999. Instead, let's work really, really hard. And if we work so hard that we're tired at night and we go to bed and we don't go out and drink, get in trouble, and create a bunch of kids illegitimately or out of wedlock, well, then that's a good thing. That's a life well lived, okay? And so they started to do things like move away from that much earlier and ancient sense of time as cyclical. The Puritans are one of the groups that move us into a sense of time is linear, right? So in a cyclical sense of time, every fall, you do what you need to do during fall time. You're gathering your crops, you're separating out the seeds, you're saving most of those seeds for next year because next spring's coming. with a linear sense of time, if we are making any progress through dint of our hard work as worship, then for darn sure we better have something to show for all that hard work. Meaning, fall of year 2, we should have a little bit more seed ready to go, leftover, surplus, than we did in year 1. And in fall of 03, we better have a little bit more than we did in 02. And we better learn a little bit more of the Bible, of how to be a good farmer or tradesman or whatever, right? There's no going back. If we slide backwards, that's actually bad. It's not cyclical, it's evil, okay? So, think of something as fundamental as your perception, your understanding of time itself. Some of these more, we would call them today, fairly fringe, small, fundamentalist movements decided that, gosh, we've been getting it wrong for 1,500 years, 1,600 years. We need to get right with God. We need to work harder, and so forth. Okay? So, back on the mainland, in the continent of Europe, this guy named John Calvin also was a reformer just after the time of Martin Luther. And John Calvin and those like him were part of the split out from sort of mainline Catholicism, and their particular approach on things was, if God is all powerful and all knowing, then God has predestined certain among us to do big things. Like He put us on this planet and has worked everything out for these people to do big things. So let's do some big things. And they tried to put together essentially an entire city government structure, top to bottom, based on their best understanding of mostly the Christian New Testament. And that was an interesting social experiment. And one thing that kind of came out of that other organizations, other groups, other movements sort of adopted was this sense of sanctification, right? So the work that we are doing in running a city, in running a farm, in running a family, all of these things have to be by the letter, by the book. And in this way, we're going to show evidence that God is refining us, making us into better people, more like Himself, more along the lines of what He put us on this earth to do, from their perspective. Whether or not you guys agree with any of this, that's fine. No big deal. Both of these groups, both of these schools of thought, basically landed on the idea as leisure is not inherently evil by itself, although the hardliners are going to say that. But it's absolutely opening the door. It's flirting with the devil. It is, man, if you are out there having fun and not working your butt off and making progress, then shoot, you are ripe for the picking, man. You are the lamb marching yourself to the slaughter. My goodness, look out. So the Puritans, started developing this way of thinking, pissing off a lot of people around them in England. And so they went to, they sort of emigrated, fleeing religious persecution from England to the mainland and places like, I think, Holland, maybe? And then eventually over to the New World, right? So in the 1600s, we're getting this ideological shift from a Greek and Roman-based understanding of the world, where in all things moderation, cyclical view of time, to medieval Europe, where we have Catholicism, but also incorporating things like the Carnival and Lent cycle, where Carnival, right, party, and then Lent, give up eating meat except on Fridays as an austerity thing to be penitent and to celebrate or mourn Christ's passing or resurrection. And then we get this shift ahead again to this Protestant and in particular Puritan aesthetic or sense or worldview or epistemology. That austerity, willfully depriving yourself of excess material wealth, willfully holding yourself back from partying in like a carnival Lent cycle, but instead just working your ass off and so forth. That leads to what God likes, which must be improvement. Okay? A linear progression sense of time and life. Okay? So, in Geneva and places like it, we get this sense that exercise is good. If you like to run, run. But it's only good to the extent that it prepares you for work. So a fit body is not an end to itself. It is a means, it is a tool in the hands of your God, right? And play is for children. And then above the age of innocence, so 11, 12, 13, depending on where you're looking, we're going to have a lot of problems with anybody playing around. To the extent that Oxford, after about 500 years of being a college, outlaws soccer or football because it was considered a savage and degenerate thing. So let's end on the idea that the sense of what is savage or degenerate has evolved over time, right? Soccer, not so bad these days. No, okay? Cool. Let's end it right there. We'll pick it up on Tuesday. I'm around for questions, but if you have a question, stay outside of my kill radius. I'm probably still contagious with whatever this is. It's probably just a sinus infection, but just in case. See you next time.